to the New Eliahan Network. I'm your host, Charles. The Washington Teachers Union just launched a major initiative called Learning Doesn't Stop, Lessons on TV. Our first class will be conducted by Caneisha Mills from Hart Middle School, and we will also check out our second class by Sarah Hjort-Tyson from Hart Middle School. Let's see what we can learn today.
Good morning, students. My name is Caneisha Mills, and I am a teacher at Rose L. Hardy Middle School as part of DC Public Schools. I teach 8th grade U.S. history, and today I want to talk to you about one key question. In U.S. history, many people in the 19th century were asking themselves, why change American society? Our objective today will be to evaluate the social reform era of the 19th century by contextualizing the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions. It is important, before we begin, to discuss the term contextualize. Contextualization means you look at a source or an event or a document and ask yourself what was happening when the document was written, how did the background of the author shape what they wrote, what happened before the writing of the document to inspire the author, and how did the time and place of the document's creation impact what was written. I generally ask myself all of these questions before, during, and after I summarize the main ideas of a document. Now, let's turn to the social reform era of the 19th century. First, it is important to note that people were fighting for workers' rights. Specifically, we know that factory work, because of the Industrial Revolution, was in its early phases. Factory work was noisy, unsafe, and often saw people working 13 to 14 hours a day. Also, you had women in mills, particularly in Lowell, Massachusetts, that were working with young children and decided to form the Lowell Female Labor Reform Association. In the 1830s and 1840s, they fought for what's known as a labor union, or where workers band together for better working conditions. I, as well as all of your teachers, are members of the Washington Teachers Union. In 1836, women decided to go on strike. That means they stopped working, all to gain better working conditions and better pay. Specifically, the women in Lowell, Massachusetts, wrote to the Massachusetts government or legislature requesting that their 13 to 14-hour day be transformed into a 10-hour working day. Also, you have people working on behalf of the needy. Specifically, Dorothea Dix was working to assist people in care for the mentally ill. Thomas Gallaudet, yes, Gallaudet University is named after him, was working to start the American School for the Deaf. Samuel Geraldine Ho started the Perkins School for the Blind. He will also be a member of one of the other movements that I will mention momentarily. Also, you had reformers such as Thomas Eddy and others working to reform prisons. Specifically, they said there should be separate institutions for children. Also, the call for rehabilitation, because many people believed that people did not commit crimes because they were evil, but because of American society itself. Also, it's important to note one of the most important movements of this time period, which is known as abolition. The abolitionist movement was a movement to call for the end of slavery. Yes, there are many debates that were happening during this time. Some people couldn't decide whether the abolition of slavery should take place over time or whether the abolition of slavery should be immediate. You have many people using their pen, such as David Walker, such as Harriet Ann Jacobs, such as Frederick Douglass, such as so many people, such as Martin Delany, and many others, all saying that there should be an immediate end to slavery, and also some calling for extra legal means. Specifically, John Brown, one of the infamous abolitionists, led a revolt in 1859. You also have Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, a teacher, no less, was writing and lecturing against slavery. All of these people are important to note because it was a variety of ways that people used to call for the end of slavery. Some holding conventions, some stopping work, some writing literature, some using lectures, all saying that there must be a movement to end slavery. One of the movements that we want to focus on today would be specifically the movement for women's rights and equality. In the 1840s, there was actually an anti-slavery convention held in London, England, but many women, such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, were denied or excluded access to this important convention and moment in time. Due to this, 8 years later, Elizabeth Cady Stanton would open up her home to many women and men who decided that we should build a movement to fight for women's equality. This is known as the Seneca Falls Convention, which takes place in New York in 1848. They decided there to write a document known as the Declaration of Sentiments, talking about the inequality that women faced on the job, that they face in their homes, that they face in terms of the right to own property, and on behalf of the government. They also made resolutions suggesting not only were men and women supposed to be treated equally, but also they asked or demanded women's suffrage, or that women should also be given the right to vote. The women's rights movement, just like in the image that you see before you, was often ridiculed, where women were told to stay in their place and that they did not belong in an open society asking for equality. Now, let's turn to a specific document, which I just mentioned, known as the Declaration of Sentiments, all to help us ask the larger question, why change American society? If you look at this document, we must first start with background information. Remember, in 1840, women were excluded from an anti-slavery convention in London. Married women were told that their property belonged to their husbands. Support, however, for the convention was found in the abolitionist movement and in the likes of men such as Frederick Douglass, who not only supported it with their words, but also publicized in their newspapers that the convention would be happening. Even though this is an important moment in time, it's also important to note that African American women did not attend this convention. Now, let's turn to the document itself, and I want to read a few excerpts so that you can understand the document. I often feel when reading primary sources, it's important to listen to the words out loud so that you can garner the meanings on the page. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries on the part of man toward woman. Also, he has compelled her to submit to laws in the formation in which she has had no voice. In marriage, she is compelled to promise obedience to her husband after depriving her of all rights as a married woman. If single and the owner of property, he has taxed her to support a government which recognizes her only when her property can be made profitable to it. Now, let's turn back to the idea of contextualization. Think about all the things that I've reviewed with you, and we will ask ourselves what was happening when they wrote this document. How did the background of the women that were at the convention shape what they wrote? What happened before the writing of this document to inspire the authors? And how did the time and place of the document's creation impact what was written? Then we should summarize the main ideas within the document. Now, you need to have both documents side by side. I would suggest looking at the Declaration of Sentiments and a document which I provided to you that will assist you with contextualizing the words that were written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others. 1. The document asks what else was going on at this time or place. Remember, when describing the time period, I've provided an example for you. In the mid-1800s, workers, people opposed to slavery, women, Native Americans, and others opposed to the conditions of America were working to change or reform American society. 2, it's important to note key details and keep them in the front of your mind. The document title, which is the Declaration of Sentiments. When the document was created and where? In Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. Who is the author of this document? Now, often when reading primary sources, I like to remind myself that words that are on a page often are representative not just of one author, but of many. So I suggest that the articles written here in the Declaration of Sentiments is not just written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but also influenced by Lucretia Mott, who's an abolitionist, Lucy Stone, who was opening up her home in the Underground Railroad, and the many other men and women that attended this convention. However, most authorship suggests that the primary words came from Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Also think about what is the author's background. Remember, she as well as other women were excluded and not allowed to speak at an anti-slavery convention in London in 1840. Then you want to move on to the summary and the main ideas within the document. I hope that this assists you in thinking about the words that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and other women wrote in the Declaration of Sentiments, but also in contextualizing what was happening during this time period. Now, after you've contextualized the document, go back to the big question: why change American society and all of the social reform movements of the 19th century? Ask yourself, or maybe even your parents, what do you think women at the Seneca Falls Convention were trying to accomplish with their Declaration of Sentiments? Also, maybe you want to discuss, why did women, abolitionists, and other reformers desire change? It is important to think of these things specifically because we must think about the movements that exist today and why people are trying today to change American society. You have students that have been rising up in protection of their schools, people that have been fighting across the country for the minimum wage to be more than $15 or at least $15 an hour. You have also nurses that have been asking for personal protection equipment in our current crisis, and women still standing on the forefront today demanding equality in American society. When you connect the past to the present, it's important to think about what reform movements exist today, and are there any connections between the movements of the past and of the present? Now, as I close out with you, I just wanted to point out a few books that I personally have enjoyed and that have contributed to the things that I know about the social reform movement, but also give me critical thinking in terms of some books. One is Lies My Teacher Told Me. This is a great resource in that sometimes it's not just about what you may find in your textbook or in only one source that I provided you today. There are specific excerpts here that talk about the relationship between John Brown and what was happening under the presidency of Abraham Lincoln. So I would definitely suggest picking this up. Two, this is one of the most recent books that I've read that I truly enjoyed. It's known as The Water Dancer. This is a book written by Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's become a fomenting author of our current age. He speaks about, in a fictional form and nonfiction to a certain extent, about what was happening during slavery and the experience of enslaved African Americans that run away. He also uses some historical depictions of individuals such as William and Ellen Craft, who disguised themselves as a man with his servant in order to run away. You'll also notice references to Henry Box Brown. He is an individual that actually put himself in a box and shipped himself to slavery in order to have freedom. So if you're more into the literary entailing of enslaved African Americans, I would definitely suggest picking up this book. Next, I wanted to point out one that I'm going through right now, known as the Abolitionist Papers. This document and documents is many volumes. This is only volume 1, and I think it's important to note that the abolitionist movement was not confined to the United States, but instead you had enslaved African Americans, formerly enslaved African Americans, free people such as William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass, not just speaking out and lecturing here within the United States, but all around the world, particularly in England and other countries, to speak out against the institution of slavery. And as you close out this year, I wanted to point out this book. You will be talking about social reform movements, but it's also important to mention what comes after the antebellum period, particularly the Civil War and Reconstruction. This book by Lerone Bennett, who is also one of the fomenting authors as well as editors of Ebony Magazine, wrote a book called Black Power USA. It really goes through the Reconstruction period and particularly what happened with Reconstruction in terms of the fomenting of schools and really telling personal narratives of individuals that were involved in the Reconstruction of the United States. Now, I just want to say, I love you. If you're my students, I miss you, as so many other teachers do, and I thank you so much to families, and I hope that you're safe and well, Until next time, bye.
Hi everyone, I'm Ms. Hjort-Tyson from Charles Hart Middle School, and I'm excited to be back with you guys for another week of distant learning. Today we're going to shift gears back a little bit to math. Specifically, we'll be talking about probability. Probability is pretty much how likely something is to happen. So to help you understand what probability is, I want to talk about a coin. Now, a coin has two sides to it. One side has a heads, and the other side has a tail. Now, if I wanted to find the probability of flipping my coin and it landing on heads, I would say that my probability of that happening is 1 out of 2. Now, let's say I wanted to find the probability of flipping a coin, and this time it landing on tails. The probability of that happening is also 1 out of 2. Now, I know you guys are probably thinking, Ms. Tyson, how do you know that's the probability? Here's how I know. When you write a probability, it always follows a specific formula. And the formula it follows goes like this. Probability is equal to the number of ways something can happen over the total number of outcomes. So if we go back to my flipping the coin example, I know my probability is 1 over 2 because there is only one side of a coin that has tails on it. There's only one way I can get a tails. However, I know that there are 2 possible outcomes because a coin has 2 sides. To help you understand this a little bit better, we're going to talk about another example. And that example is, we're going to talk about a dice. Now, for those of you that know, a dice has 6 sides. Each side has a different number on it, ranging from 1 to 6. So there's a 1, we have a 5, we have a 6, we have a 2. Now, what if I wanted to find the probability of rolling this dice and the dice landing on 1? Writing that probability, I would write it as 1 over 6. And the reason I would write it as 1 over 6 is because 1 is the number of ways it could happen because only one side of my dice has a 1 on it. And 6 is the total number of outcomes because there are 6 sides on a dice. So the probability of rolling a 1 is 1 out of 6. Now let's look at another example. Let's say that I want to roll my same dice, and this time I want to find the probability of rolling an even number. Now remember, even numbers are numbers divisible by 2. So when we look at a dice, I know that there are 3 even numbers on a dice: 2, 4, and 6. So when it comes to finding the probability of rolling an even number, I know the probability of that is 3 over 6. And the reason I know it's 3 over 6 is because 3 represents the number of ways it could happen because 3 sides of my dice have even numbers on them. And then 6 represents the total number of possible outcomes because there are 6 sides to a dice. Now, all of you out there should be noticing something about this fraction. And what you should be noticing is that we can reduce it. And the reason we can reduce it is because 3 and 6 both have a greatest common factor of 3. So if I divide my numerator and my denominator both by 3, I get a new fraction. And that new fraction, or an equivalent fraction, is 1/2. So what this means is when I'm talking about the probability of rolling an even number on a dice, the probability is either 3 over 6 or 1/2. Now, you could write your probability either way. It's just I wanted to show you guys how, since probabilities are written as fractions, you can still reduce them. So now, I'm going to show you another example. And this example is a favorite in my house. Now, my kids love. I mean, they absolutely love chocolate candies. They love them so much that when I buy them, I have to buy a lot of them. Now, my oldest son, his favorite chocolate candies are the blue ones. So what I want to do is find the probability of my son pulling out a blue candy from this jar. Now, how am I going to do that? Here's how we're going to do that. The first thing I would need to do is take all of these candies and divide them into different piles based on their colors. So I would have a blue pile, a red pile, a green pile, or an orange pile. Now, after I've done that, I need to go through and count all of the candies in each pile. Now, to save us some time, I've already done that, and here is our data. So I've discovered that in this jar, I have 400 red candies. I have 50 orange candies, 100 green candies, 300 blue candies, 250 yellow candies, and 100 brown candies. Now, in total, when I add all these numbers up, I know that in this jar, there are 1,200 candies. So now, let's get writing our probability. Remember, our probability is written as the number of ways something can happen over the total number of outcomes. So when it comes to finding the probability of pulling out a blue candy, I would write my probability as 300 over 1,200. And the reason I'm doing that is because I know that there are 300 blue candies in my jar, and I know that there are a total of 1,200 candies inside this jar. So the probability of my son pulling out a blue candy is 300 over 1,200. Now, all my mathematicians out there should be realizing something, and they should be realizing that this fraction can also be reduced. And the reason it can be reduced is that my numerator and my denominator have a greatest common factor of 300. So I'm going to divide my numerator and my denominator by 300, and what I get is 1 over 4. So I could also say that the probability of pulling out a blue M&M is 1 over 4. Now, let's take it a step further. What if I was to ask you, what is the probability of pulling a white candy out of this jar? Now, I know a lot of you out there are thinking, but Ms. Tyson, we can't do that. And the reason we can't do that is because there are no white candies in that jar. And you guys are perfectly correct. When it comes to writing the probability of pulling a white candy out of this jar, we would say that that probability is 0. And the reason that probability is 0 is because it's never going to happen. I will never be able to pull a white candy out of this jar. Now, when we say something has a probability of 0, we know that it's never going to happen. So what's the opposite of a probability of 0? The opposite of a probability of 0 is a probability of 1. Now, what does it mean to have a probability of 1? Think of it like this. What if I asked you, what is the probability of reaching into this jar of candy and pulling out a piece of candy? Now, I know you're thinking, but Ms. Tyson, that whole jar is full of candy, and you're right. So if I was to write my probability as a fraction, the way I would write it is the number of ways that can happen would be 1,200. Because if I'm just pulling out a candy, I know there's 1,200 candies in here. And if I wanted to also write the total number of outcomes, my total number of outcomes is also 1,200. So what this means is that the probability of pulling any candy out of this jar is 1,200 over 1,200, which we know any number over itself is also equal to 1. Now, something with a probability of 1 means it's guaranteed to happen. It's gonna happen no matter what. So if you see a probability of 1, it's going to happen. So now that we've reviewed probability, what I want to do now is I want to review a problem that you're going to see in your distant learning packet. And here is that problem. Now, in this data chart, what we see is a student in the 7th grade went around and surveyed 25 students about how many hours they spend playing outside. So on this chart, I see that 3 students spent 0 hours playing outside, 4 students spent 1 hour playing outside, 5 students spent 2 hours playing outside, and so forth and so forth. So now what we're going to do is we're going to use our newfound knowledge of probability to talk about some probabilities we can see from this data. So the first thing I'm going to ask you is, what is the probability that students played outside for 8 hours? Now, in order to write this probability, the first thing I need to figure out is the number of ways it happened. So in order to find that out, I'm going to come down here to my chart for 8 hours, and I see that 1 student played outside. So now I need to find out the total possible number of outcomes. And the way I'm going to do that is just to add all these together. And when I do that, I get 25. So my probability is 1 over 25. The probability that a student played outside for 8 hours is 1 out of 25. So now let's look at the probability that a student played outside for 3 hours. We're going to do this same process. We're going to come to our chart. We're going to go to 3 hours, and we see that 7 students played outside. So the numerator of my fraction becomes 7, because that's the number of ways it could happen. And then my denominator remains 25. So my probability that a student played outside for 3 hours is 7 over 25. So now we have one more to look at. And that one is going to ask us, what is the probability that a student played outside for 6 or more hours? Now, to find out if a student played outside for 6 or more hours, we're going to come to our chart and we're going to look at the rows that represents 6, 7, and 8 hours. And we are going to add these 3 numbers together. So 2 plus 0 plus 1 is 3. So the probability that a student played outside for more than 6 hours or 6 hours or more is 3 out of 25. So thank you everybody for joining me today for a quick lesson on probability. I hope you had fun. I look forward to seeing you next time. For more resources on today's lesson, please check out the Washington Teachers Union page, and I hope you guys have a great and fantastic weekend. Bye.